even though I'm so far away and I can't like claim all of those plagues that are going on in Peru right now, but I still have so much love to be Peruvian and for the Peruvian people. And the reason why I'm a communist, the reason why I try to fight here in the belly of the beast is for doing my part that I can for a better life for my people back home, because they deserve it. They've been under siege, they've been attacked, they've been dominated by foreigners since 1492.
Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Ramiro with Anticonquista. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And today we're speaking with Kayla Pop, who's a Peruvian-Haitian student and worker based in my hometown, New York. She's in New York right now, bearing the brunt of the coronavirus, which unfortunately has affected the world. But we're here to talk about something that we don't really talk about much on Anticonquista, and I've been wanting to talk about and learn more about for a while, which is the history of Peruvian socialism, the history of revolutionary movements in Peru, and moving forward, movements for social change in Peru that will eventually make waves in Latin America and the Caribbean. Peru is often left out of a lot of mainstream media coverage, and we want to jump into the history of radicalism in Peru, starting with colonization all the way up until today. So that's what I'm hoping to speak with Kayla Pop about today. Thank you for supporting Anticonquista. You've been one of the people who have followed and supported us for a while. So thank you for getting on with us.
Thank you for doing this, bringing Anticonquista to life.
For sure. So Kayla, tell me a little bit about, first, as your experience as a Peruvian, someone with Peruvian roots, how do you identify politically, and how is it connected to the history of Peru and colonization?
So, I mean, I was born here, I was raised here, but all of my family are like the ones that I was raised by, they're all from Peru. And the thing is, and I've been to Peru a lot. I lived in Peru for several months at one time when I was 12. And, I'm really proud to be Peruvian. And I just immersed myself in so much love, even though I'm so far away and I can't like claim all of those plagues that are going on in Peru right now. But I still have so much love to be Peruvian and for the Peruvian people. And the reason why I'm a communist, the reason why I try to fight here in the belly of the beast is for doing my part that I can for a better life for my people back home, because they deserve it. They've been under siege, they've been attacked, they've been dominated by foreigners since 1492. Well, really, the 1500s, but still, you know what I mean. And my people deserve it. And they tried, right? They were so close in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. You thought maybe things would change. And then, of course, United States doing what the United States does and funds death squads in Peru that never came out to be. But, we can't never stop. We got to have that revolutionary optimism for the future.
Exactly. And Peru is a country that has a very rich revolutionary history that unfortunately a lot of people don't really know about. Before we get into modern socialism in Peru, I wanted to obviously get into some of the historical context that affects Peru today. Tell us about Indigenous society in Peru. What was life like in Peru before the Spanish came, before it was even called Peru? What was it like at that time?
So, I wasn't there, right? We can only know from our stories. Obviously, you know about the Incan Empire and how the Incas were like the largest empire at the time. But what a lot of people don't know is that before the Incas, they were like the Chimu people. Well, Peruvians know this. They were the Chimu people, and the Incas were able to outlive them through war and conquer, but ended up taking a lot of their aspects and a lot of their culture. So indigenous people in Peru, there were many different groups of nations of people within the Incan Empire, but they were the ones that had discovered surfing. So the Peloponnesian people were able to do surfing standing up, but what a lot of people don't know is Peruvian people were able to do surfing like sitting down. And that's how they, we have the coast, the Pacific coast, and they were able to like mine fish, gather fish that way. And if you go to like the coast, I mean, all the coastal cities in like the Andean nations are, seafood. Obviously, it's a really big thing, which was developed because of the Incas' ability to be able to surf. They had their own plumbing system. They had roads, extensive roads to be able to connect everybody in the empire. And even though it was built on the mountains, they were able to like create these stepping stones that you could still walk through the mountains. Like it's like, forget being a goat. They made it happen. And there was more like collectivized labor. They forced everybody to work, but it was also like, all right, whatever we gather, we will also distribute somewhat kind of equally. There were 40,000 different languages spoken during the Incan Empire. But one of the reasons why, like, Quechua, which its actual real name is Rumaisimi, which means the people's language, Quechua and Aymara were like the surviving languages because they were spoken by the elite. And so today they still speak that in many parts. I think like 1/4 of Peru still speaks Quechua, and you're welcome to learn it in school. Yeah, that's just some brief stuff. There were like over 10 million people in the empire at the time.
I know earlier we were talking about the different perspectives about Inca society. On the one hand, you have these right-wing assholes who are like, oh, they were savages. They were, they ate kids' hearts and shit like that, right? Which is like the far-right perspective, the white imperialist perspective about the Incas. But then you also have the more liberal and sometimes leftist view that over-romanticizes Inca society without understanding the class nature of Inca society and the stratification of civilizations within that broader civilization. So I wanted to ask you, like, how should we as communists who promote and support indigenous socialism and an indigenous approach to Latin American politics, how should we understand the Inca society before colonization?
Right. I don't want to like try to get too much in that like those right wing, colonialist mentalities that they're all savages and that. But you also do have to be honest that just because the Incas were indigenous people doesn't mean that they didn't have an empire. They weren't in their own, nation of people. I mean, never justifies what Europeans did, and it was never to that extent. But they did I wouldn't say colonize, they did conquer and force other groups in their area to submit to their will, whether through war or what they would say, you come peacefully or we'll burn down your villages. So we have to be careful to not romanticize and group the Incan people as one, because they were very different. Like same thing with the Aztecs. They were different nations of people who had different opinions about how to look at their own ruling class at the time, which were the Quechua people, the Quechua people speaking people. And, it's really relevant to think about that when you notice like what happened in Bolivia and how you did see some indigenous people that did not support Evo Morales. And that was because most of them were Quechua people. There's always been this beef between the Aymara people and the Quechua people because the Aymara people were like inferior and were treated as lesser than to the Quechua people. So these beefs still linger today. So as people who aren't indigenous, we have to also be really respectful and not try to, glorify what was, because it still wasn't a just society, but also respect that what happened then, it was its own right and it never justifies what happened afterwards.
Yeah, no, I think that's the right approach, like having a scientific understanding of societies, the good, the bad, taking the good. And I mean, on the plus side, the techniques of agriculture and astronomy of the Incas was way more advanced than anything that was going on in Europe at the time.
That's why the Spanish. All right, so I want to jump into the colonization real quick.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I hate the most in these like right-wing colonialist mentalities is that they were able to conquer one of the largest empires. That's not what happened at all. Francisco Pizarro just got there at the right time in the right place. They when he popped up in there with his 40 men, Atahualpa and Huascar were not thinking about him at all. So just so I guess people over here have some background about what it was. It was Manco Inca had passed away, and he was like the ruler of the Incan Empire. So I'm talking about, what year was it? I think it was about 1532. He was the leader of the Incan Empire. When he passed away, he gave the southern part he gave actually just Quito and like that northern part, which is now Ecuador, to his son Atahualpa, and the rest was for his son Huáscar. And those two brothers ended up beefing about, like, they had a war. They had a civil war because one of them wanted to rule all of it. They don't want to split it into different things. So, it was kind of like this silly greed that, like, you fought yourselves to your own ruin, right? So Atahualpa started working with the Spanish because he was just like, okay, some supporters, they're going to help us out, whatever. And Huáscar was like, who are these white men? Like, what they were just like servants, right? He was more worried about his brother than he was ever thinking about Francisco Pizarro and his 40 little Spaniards. Because of that civil war, it was able to weaken the Incan society. The country had split into the empire had split into like two different sides. Do we support this brother? Do we support that brother? And eventually Atahualpa, playing with the enemy because he didn't know their true intentions. He just thought they were like going to be supporters for him. He ended up getting himself killed by them. And after that, they were easily, after a weakened empire, weakened by its own ruin, were they able to not conquer, but they just took over the Incan Empire because it had destroyed itself, right? You go into a place that's already you go to a building that's already been damaged and you're just like, I did this. And you just happened to be there at the right time. And now because the Incas' agriculture system was so advanced, the way that they had labor was so advanced, the way that they had their large cities was so advanced, that it was really easy for the Spanish to just set up camp there and just take over what the Incas had already built. Because the Incas already had this huge empire. They did all the work for them. They just took it over. They just made themselves the boss.
Right. There was already an infrastructure in place. And I wanted to, moving forward a little bit, go into the so-called independence movements. During the early 1800s, most of Latin America and the Caribbean, kicking off with Haiti. We can't leave out Haiti after the 1804 Haitian Revolution that was responsible for the uprisings across the Americas against European colonialism. And in Peru, things happened a little differently. They were under the Spanish boot for a little longer. And it wasn't until Simón Bolívar from Venezuela and José de San Martín from Argentina invaded Peru from the north and the south to remove it from Spanish power. Why do you think it was that during the so-called independence movement era, why was Peru the bastion of Spanish colonialism? And why weren't these so-called independence movements real movements for independence?
Because I think those independence movements at that time really set the path for how all of Latin America and Latin Americans' national identities came to be. So we also have to, we can't forget Lima. Even though Lima's it doesn't seem as much of a popular or big, important city. I mean, it is an important city, but when you talk about Latin America today, you're feel like you think about Colombia or Brazil, you think of other places, you think of Mexico, you don't think of Peru automatically. But at that time, Lima was the capital for Spain in all of Latin America. And so it was the strongest hold for the Spanish people because they had so much investment already in Lima. They had so many people, so much power in Lima. Now, why I say that the independence movements weren't as popular in Peru than they could have been. So the truth is that these independence movements were led by the criollos. They were led by the Spanish descendant aristocracy because they did not support the Bourbons' reforms. When the Bourbons took away repartimiento and reparto, that was one of the reasons why Tupac Amaru in Peru's revolution really kicked off, was because now that the Bourbons were okay, so for some people who don't know, let's say the Spanish colonizer found some land, right? And he found it for the Spanish king. Now he was able to be the governor of this land, and all the native people that worked there on this land, would have to work for 9 months out of the year for free for him. Now, it wasn't slavery because they were not allowed to enslave indigenous people from the Spanish. They had like laws. I forget the law, leyes de los indios. But they were not allowed to enslave indigenous people. But they had to work for them, whoever was the governor of their land, for 9 months out of the year for free. So that was repartimiento, and el reparto was like when they would extract materials out of Latin America, they would produce a product in Spain, and then they would sell it back in Latin America, and indigenous people in different like nations were supposed to buy a certain amount of it. So it's like, you just stole from us, you made something with our stuff, and now you're forcing us that we can't afford to do, where you're forcing us to pay for it. So the Bourbons were trying to take away a lot of the power of the criollos in Latin America, and the criollos didn't like that. So they kept up the system because at the end of the day, the Bourbons are in Spain and the criollos are here in South America. So they kept up the system, but now it was unregulated. And it was even more so crushing indigenous people. And that's what, like, during that time, it was like 1 year, it was much earlier, I think 17 something. I'm sorry, I'm bad with the dates. But in that year, there were 96 different revolts. And a lot of them were coming from Peru and Bolivia. And one of those were the Tupac Amaru's revolution, where initially they were just saying, like, we want you to regulate this because they're crushing us. But because of the Spanish silence, then it became, you know what, we want independence from Spain. Now that was eventually crushed, and we know how that was crushed. But going back to why it wasn't really as popular in Peru, there is actually not many documents about African people, Afro-Peruvians or Afro people in all of Latin America that have with their names written on it. But so for some people who don't know, a lot of Africans were brought to Peru and Bolivia for mining. And so there is, I don't remember the name of the people, but I've seen it. It is this artifact, it is this letter found in Spain, I think is in Sevilla, where they still have like all the archives from Latin America. And in there's a letter that a captain of one of a mining group in Peru and all of his people, they were all Afro-Peruvians, they were writing to him saying that we have been loyal to you throughout this revolution. We support you. We do not want independence, but you need to help us out. You need to make sure that we'll be protected. And the reason for that is because at the end of the day, it was a revolution built by the criollos because they wanted to remain the aristocracy. It wasn't like, oh, we want independence from Spain so we can be kumbaya here. We want independence from Spain because they're trying to take away our power and we want to continue oppressing these people. They're making they're taking all of our riches. And that did not win a lot of the trust of the indigenous people or African people, right? They're like, we don't trust you. And what Simón Bolívar was able to do that none of the other criollos were able to do was to say, like, at the end of the day, we are all Americans. Like this idea of Pan-Americans, that doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, like what nation you belong to. At the end of the day, like, we're here and we need to protect ourselves away from these Europeans. And so with that, I mean, it was kind of able to change, but that's just my belief as to why. And at the end of the day, that also shaped how Latin America is today, who are still all the leaders and all the heads of the economy, who owns the means of productions. It's Italians and Spanish, their children, right? So not much has changed ever since then, but yeah, that's my 2 cents on that.
That's so true. I'm glad you mentioned the dynamics of Peruvian society because I imagine Peru is similar to Ecuador. I used to live in Ecuador, and it's kind of divided into 3 sections. There's like the coast, la costa, la sierra, and the Amazonas. So you have like different societies, and the way the treatment, and I'm sure it's very similar in Peru as well, that like on the coast you have, descendants of enslaved African people who live on the coast. And you also have the criollos who set up their base in Lima. And Ecuador is kind of like Guayaquil. And that's where a lot of the banking institutions are that own a lot of the resources. And then in the Sierra, you have the majority indigenous people who perform most of the labor and are heavily exploited in the country, and there's tremendous amount of racism against them. And then in the Amazonas is where you have a lot of the also indigenous groups, but you also have the presence of a lot of oil that has been colonized and extracted by multinational corporations. And they have what they call in Ecuador as well, in Peru, oro negro, black gold, because of the amount of oil that's in the Amazon, which a lot of companies have completely devastated. So I'm glad you mentioned the dynamic, because people tend to think of Peru as only being, one type of way, mainly just indigenous, but there's different power dynamics in play, different nations within the country. And it's interesting to see, reading about the history of Peru, the way that the British capitalism was able to come in and take advantage of those divisions, because they designed railroads across the Andes in Peru that only benefited, the white elites, and it didn't connect the country as a whole. The infrastructure that was created by British capitalists to extract minerals and resources was designed for the British capitalists and not for the oppressed nations of Peru. And so I wanted to ask you, like, what are some of the resources, like, following quote unquote independence, in the 1800s? What are some of the resources that the British capitalists were after? I know one of them was nitrates, or guaro. There's this nitrate that can be used for gunpowder, and the British actually used that in their war of colonization against India. And so Peru was really important for the British, and also fertilizer. So, like, it was really interesting. I was reading about it because, when you think of imperialism in Latin America, you normally think about the US and Spain. And in the late 1800s, I was reading about how the British purposely pitted the indigenous and the mestizo in Peru against each other. And they basically wanted to extract a lot of resources in southern Peru, going toward the Atacama Desert, because of the rich mineral resources. That region is very important in terms of mineral resources and mineral wealth for weapons, for fertilizer. There's also a lot of gold in that region. And that area is a heavily indigenous area. And what the British did in the late 1800s is that they supported the Criollo Chileans in invading the coastal Bolivian areas and also parts of Peru during the War of the Pacific. It's just crazy because the British have perfected that model, and they used it at the same time against India, against in terms of dividing Hindus and Muslims and the partition. And so it's interesting to see those connections, right, between how they were able to exploit racial and class divisions in Peru and apply those methods to India at the time of colonization. And I'm so glad you mentioned the anti-indigenous sentiment. It's fucking disgusting to see how much anti-indigenous sentiment there is in Latin America, including in South America.
I mean, not to say that not of all of Latin America, but I feel like this South America is in this. I mean, this is all indigenous land. How dare you? How dare you disrespect the people whose land you are sitting on? Right? Like, it's disgusting. Like, this land is beautiful because of the indigenous people. How dare you disrespect them? How dare you look down upon them?
Yeah, it's super fucked up. And taking into consideration the indigenous question, the national question, is so important whenever we talk about revolutionary history in Peru. And that takes me to another point that I wanted to ask you about. Into the early 1900s, who was Aya de la Torre and what was APRA? Because there was this group called the Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana. From the research that I was doing, they were kind of like a pan Latin American left-leaning organization. They weren't explicitly communist. They were like more kind of social democratic or socialist.
I actually have a picture of him. And I should have brought this out. Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
This is my great-grandfather, Papa Carlos.
That's your great-grandfather?
My great-grandfather was, like, it was interesting, right? He was more on the side, I mean, now he's passed away, so I can say this. He was more on the side of, like, Sendero Luminoso. And that was also one of the reasons why he ended up immigrating to Canada for a few years. But yeah. Cool.
No, and I wanted to ask you, because, like, and we'll get into Sendero Luminoso in a bit. In terms of APRA, I know they were founded in 1924, which was at that time, I find the history of APRA really fascinating because they were one of the few organizations in Latin America at the time to call for a united Latin America under socialism, under progressive anti-imperialism. And at the same time in Central America, you had Sandino and Farabundo Martí, who wanted to also create a communist party of Central America. And they also wanted to create kind of like a second international, kind of like what existed at the time during the Soviet Union. So in 1924, you have the creation of the Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana, founded by Aya de la Torre. And in 1928, you have the creation of the Partido Comunista Peruano by José Carlos Mariátegui. So I wanted to ask you, Kayla, like, who are these people? What did these organizations represent? And why did they have different visions for socialism in Peru?
Mariátegui is like the godfather of Latin American communism, right? The apristas, I think that they really had to go their separate ways, and there was actually like a lot of sectarianism within the Peruvian Communist Party, which will lead us later into the whole 80s and 90s. But I think what the apristas, they had a really good initial platform, but their problem then became that they relied too much on Aya de la Torre instead of like developing themselves as cadre, right? And when he was no longer in their position, they just kind of fell to liberalism. If you ask me now about the apristas, I mean, they're still a huge part of Peruvian politics, but they're all social democrats now.
Yeah.
All the same people that are shitting on Venezuela, even though they probably would be very similar. The thing with the whole idea of Pan-Americanism versus like, I guess I would say there would be a less of a emphasis on like the national question between both of these different groups, in terms of like the nations that exist inside of all of them, right? That the apristas just never really did answer to. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's totally right. It seems like the vibe that I get from the apristas were that they were kind of more like whiter, lighter skinned Criollo descendant lefties from Lima, who were more on the college campuses and were more in like the institutions, whereas the Partido Comunista Peruano and José Carlos Mariátegui, they really understood the national question in the way that the apristas didn't. Like you said, they understood that any form of socialism that were to come about in Peru had to incorporate the indigenous people front and center, because they are the majority, because they are the oppressed nation. And the divides between the apristas and the Partido Comunista Peruano reminds me a lot of the divisions between Trotsky and Stalin. I myself and those of us anti-conquista who are more in line with a socialism in one country versus permanent revolution, which is the Trotskyist idea that, you know, we have to wait for Europe and these developed capitalist countries to start the revolution first in the industrial areas, and then we can do it here in Russia. It reminds me a lot of kind of the view that apristas had of, you know, we need revolution in Lima and these white middle-class Peruvians first, whereas Mariátegui, and in a similar way to Stalin, understood that there is a prison house of nations within Peru, that the oppressed nations would lead that revolution because they were the most oppressed sectors. And I think that's why the class divisions between the left in Peru in the 20s are really fascinating to me, because they were also playing out in the Soviet Union at that time.
I think it was Lenin that wrote about the labor aristocracy. I think that's the word. It's like the difference between, and why I think that, like, let's say even in the United States, right? If a revolution was to pop off, it's, even though New York is the city of the most inequality in the country, it's not going to pop off here because we have a labor aristocracy, right? And these are the problems with social democracy, that it keeps us just enough, right? We benefit off of the labor of other workers. We're still working class. We're still suffering in our own ways, but we're up just enough where we sit and we bide and we take it, versus the most oppressed. Like, the most oppressed are Black people in the South, right? That's where it's going to kick off. And Lenin wrote about that, which Trotsky was like, what? Never saw that.
He's like, what's that? No, and I think that's why Peruvian socialism, the history of Peruvian socialism is so fascinating to me, because you're seeing divisions that were played out in other places. And that leads me to, going a little further into the 20th century. During the Cold War, obviously you have the Soviet Union versus the U.S. And in 1961, you have the Sino-Soviet split between the Soviet Union under Nikita Khrushchev and the People's Republic of China under Mao, and then eventually, later the Gang of Four, and in Peru at the time there was a professor of philosophy named Abimael Guzman, who was originally in the Partido Comunista Peruano and founded the Shining Path in the late 60s. What was the Shining Path? First of all, where did the name come from? What did they stand for? And what was their view of socialism? Because to my understanding, they also opposed the traditional Marxist-Leninists in Peru because they were more aligned with the Soviet Union, and the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, was aligned with China at the time. So what was going on there?
I just want to backtrack 1 second and also talk about Juan Velasco. He's a general in Peru. And here's the thing. I don't know too much about his politics to say whether he was a communist or not, but I know that he was left-wing. And he was a military guy, kind of like, you would say, in many ways he reminds me of Chavez. He was a military guy who led a coup d'etat and ended up in power in Peru. And one of the first things that he ended up doing was nationalizing the Peruvian oil companies. And because of that, right after that, he was immediately demonized by the United States. He was the same president that made the Quechua language one of the national languages, and then the Aymara language, the national language of Peru. And they put it into the Constitution. And if I'm not mistaken, he might have also been during the same presidency where they apologized towards the treatment of Black people. But eventually there was a coup d'etat orchestrated by foreign powers that be, Euro-America,
of course,
that ended up taking him out. All because this was the war for Latin America. The Cold War was Latin America became kind of the proxy during the Cold War. You look at Cuba and all the death squads in Central America. Unfortunately, Latin America kind of reaped the woes of it. The plight had the biggest plights of it. So then, yes, after the leftist movement in Peru was I feel like it was getting stronger. Much stronger than it is now. So the Partido Comunista de Peru, they had a lot of, like I said, there was a lot of sectarianism, a lot of different groups, and they ended up having a lot of splits. All communists just can't stop splitting. And so the Sendero Luminoso, as you know, they took their name from Mariátegui. And I love this quote. It is on my Instagram, and it was in English translation, Marxism, Leninism will be the shining path of the future. And that's so Sendero Luminoso means shining path. And they took that name from his quote. Now, Guzman, he developed this idea of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, which, rejected traditional Marxism, Leninism because it was too aligned with the Soviet Union. And if I'm not an expert on their ideas, but I know that they have this emphasis on protracted People's War, and they were just gearing. So they did a lot of things right. I want to say that. Okay, so before I keep jumping the gun, right? They were the PCPSL, right? And then I feel like we got to talk about this a little simultaneously, though, because another split from the group was an actual Marxist-Leninist party that ended up becoming the MRTA, the Movimiento Revolucionario de Tupac Amaru, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement. And this one group was Marxist-Leninist, while the Sendero Luminoso was Marxist-Leninist Maoist. They were reflected in the revolution that happened in China, because in many ways the conditions were very similar to how Peru was at the time. It was mostly not so much of a working class as there were a peasant class, and living in extreme poverty. And so and because of that, they had their biggest base was the indigenous people in La Sierra, in Arequipa, in Ayacucho. That was their base. And Then they did set up bases though in Lima, but it wasn't as strong as in Lima as we could say. I mean, Lima is the center of like Criolloville in Peru, and also just a power of whiteness and the labor aristocracy. So not to say that they didn't have support in Lima, they did have support in Lima, but they just had more support amongst the indigenous peasants and workers. And because of that, that led to a lot of violence against indigenous people. I mean, I think that we can say in many ways it was like another somewhat genocide of indigenous people, specifically though because of political relations, like your affiliation, you become indigenous, you're affiliated now with these leftist guerrilla groups. I actually presented in one of my classes about the MRTA, and I became really interested in them for the fact that there's just not a lot of written material about them as much as there is Sendero Luminoso, because at the end of the day, Sendero Luminoso had like 10,000 members. So, I mean, though they had a lot of faults, they made a lot of mistakes, they were still able to get 10,000 Peruvians to support them. So, you know, that cannot be ignored. I wrote about them in one of these articles for when I was in the Workers' World Party. So I guess I'll just read a little bit about that. But it was brief. So the biggest focus of the MRTA was to combat this is why they're cool. They combated imperialism within Peru, and they declared war on the United States and the Peruvian government. And so once they declared war on the United States, they were like, any presence of the U.S. government in our country, it's on site. Like, they kidnapped the business executives, they robbed banks, they kidnapped the director of the Kentucky Fried Chicken in Lima.
Yeah.
That's wild. That's what's up. That's what's up.
They were like, you owe us money for war taxes. And he had to leave the country.
Yo.
So the CIA actually has a document on them and called them one of the greatest terrorist threats to U.S. interests in South America. And they also compared them to like the Cubans and the National Liberation Armies in Colombia and Bolivia. And they were saying that they were getting training from Libya in the 80s and the 90s. It was one of their last terrorist attacks in 1996 when Fujimori was president, and they were having a celebration in the embassy for one of the Japanese emperor's birthday. And so they went to the Japanese embassy in Lima, and they held it hostage for, I think it was 40 days. The hostages were told their stories about how, at first they were scared, but after a while, like, they could tell that these people didn't want to hurt them or anything. They just wanted to get their message across. And what ended up happening was that the Peruvian army was able to invade. I mean, they stood down and everything. And they killed all of the terrorists on site, like even the two 16-year-old girls, and chopped their body up into little pieces. And one of the aunts of one of those who died was actually arrested for trying to hold a burial for her nephew.
Wow.
So, that could say a lot about the character of the Peruvian army at the time. It was really just a terror against the people. It was a war on the people.
Right. You mentioned Fujimori, Alberto Fujimori. Who was he? Like, tell us a little bit about who he was, why he came to power, what were the forces that supported him, and what ended up happening to him?
So, and another thing, we mentioned it a little bit before about how people have this idea of what Peru is. And it's always like the silliest thing because, yes, I mean, the majority of Peruvians are indigenous people, but Peru is a really, really diverse country. We have a lot of Chinese people that ended up coming during, I think it was like the early 90s to also help out in the mining. So like you can see how like they brought in a different group of people to exploit their labor who ended up being like a huge part of like the Peruvian identity now. I mean, the second best food of Peruvian food, chifa, is Peruvian Chinese food. So good. Okay. So Fujimori was actually of Japanese descent, and he was a right-winger who got into power through, I mean, this time of terror, right? This time of like, we don't know what we need. We want something strong. We want somebody to give us some sort of stability, but he was, at the end of the day, he was a right-winger. And he did like, I think it was in 1994, he did a self-coup d'etat, which just like reestablished his own power as president. Um, and he became a dictator because of this. I would really call it a civil war within Peru, even though it was never like official. It was really a civil war. I mean, the way that the Peruvian military was acting against its own people just for being indigenous. It's very similar to the civil war in Guatemala. Um, and so he became a dictator. He formed with the U.S. funding the Colina Group, which was a death squad that would go into La Sierra and anybody that was indigenous. What do you know about Sendero Luminoso? Nothing. Shot. Like I forgot to mention when I presented my project on MRTA, this girl came up in class and just started talking. And she was Peruvian. She was from Peru, and she told us a story about how her mother had two brothers, and the two brothers were asked for information on Sendero Luminoso, but they genuinely did not know anything about Sendero Luminoso. And they were killed anyway for not giving information to the military. Simply because we're indigenous people, they had to know something about them, right? This is why I say it was like a genocide, re-genocide against indigenous people, because they were the most revolutionary in Peru and they had every right to be. Their land was being occupied by foreigners like Fujimori, who ended up being a dictator. And so this also comes like during the 80s and the 90s, the U.S. War on drugs, right? When they wanted a war against cocaine, and what a lot of people like, Colombia always gets this rep as like the cocaine country because that's where they had like all those really big time narco traffickers. But so coca, don't want to like be the one to demonize coca as like cocaine, because coca is actually a sacred leaf, and it's really sacred to Peruvian and Bolivian culture. That I know. I think maybe the Ecuadorians too, but it is a really sacred leaf. I mean, you go to I don't want to say any house in Lima. You can go to specific houses, but you can come to my family's house in Lima and you can have some coca tea. And it's just, it just relaxes you and calms you down. It's like, it's not nothing crazy, right?
For the altitude, it helps with your headaches as well.
Helps with the altitude. Everybody says this. Like, you have problems, just choose some coca. It'll help you out. It'll make you feel better. Some people get altitude sickness, have some coca. It's fine. It is far demonized, and it became really demonized because racism also had a layer to it. So they ended up, with the United States' help, they ended up privatizing and banning indigenous people from producing coca. And that just gave them an excuse to go into indigenous communities and arrest people if you were producing coca. But what they ended up doing was also privatizing all the lands that produced coca for Euro-American companies, which is the sketchiest thing to me, because I'm like, why are you privatizing something that you're supposed to be banning? What are you doing with it? And for that, it has always like contributed to what they say now, even about Evo Morales, because he's an indigenous Aymara person who coca is a special part of all of, Bolivian, Peruvian culture's lives. And so for him to not demonize it, now he's a he's a leftist and he's indigenous and he doesn't demonize coca. Oh, that's it. He's a narco trafficker. Like, that's it. We need to find him. Even though Fujimori's presidential plane was found with, I think it was, how much? I wrote about it, but it was found with some tons of cocaine on the plane.
Fucking wily, man.
Started about Vladimir Montesinos, like, what I thought. Okay, so anyway, though, in 2001, Fujimori ended up getting. He quickly became. I mean, not quickly, but he ended up becoming really severely unpopular with the Peruvian people, especially once they found out all the death squads that he ran, and there was like 20 years of pain, of loss, of suffering. So it also set back the socialist movement, because at the end of the day, the right wingers did win. And they demonized the hell out of socialism. I mean, that is why there's so much xenophobia against Venezuelans right now. They demonized it, but they also, like Fujimori did, he'll never be able to repay what he did, but he was put on trial and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Then in 2017, Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, a Polish guy who was president of Peru, because everybody except the Peruvian, right?
Peru.
He ended up pardoning Fujimori, even though he literally ran on the platform that I'm not going to not pardon him, because he was running against Keiko Fujimori, who was Alberto Fujimori's daughter. And so he has two children. I think he has more, but two of his children, Kiko and Kenji, are both in Peruvian politics. But right now, they're both facing trial on corruption charges. Both of them. So.
Wow. That whole family is corrupt. And I know in the 2000s, like, you have like Alan Garcia, who was president, Ollanta Humala, who was president. And both of them were kind of like social democratic, liberal politicians who also became unpopular. And I feel like that feeds into that narrative in Peru of like, oh, the left is inefficient, they're bad. And so moving forward, like in 2020, where do you see the left in Peru today? Like, what are some of the main issues that is galvanizing the working class in Peru? I know in Arequipa, for example, which is like a small mining town in southern Peru, there's a big movement of communism and socialism that is reviving on Instagram. I see in Peru, there's all these groups that are coming up, these radical groups that are reclaiming the legacy of Mariátegui, that are reclaiming the legacy of the Partido Comunista Peruano. And so in 2020, where do you see the left in Peru now? Are they in a strong position, a weak position? And what are some of the main issues that are affecting the working class in Peru today?
What has united a lot of Peruvians into realizing that this all has to be thrown away was that, right, the center left, the social democrats are corrupt. The right-wingers are corrupt. Our judges are corrupt. Our military is corrupt. Like every aspect that is the Peruvian institution, corruption is everywhere, and it's pervasive into all of the institutions. And so I think that has united the Peruvian people in realizing that like this all has to be done away with and restarted. And so that focusing of corruption. Also, I've noticed that like the Peruvian education is in many ways has become a lot more progressive than even the one that I was brought up with here in New York. And that like the last time I was there, I was looking at my cousin's homework and she had to define machismo and racismo. And I'm like, look at you, Silvana. Like, okay. And I did see that, like, there was the women, the International Working Women's Day, they have protests all over Latin America, and especially Afro-Peruvian women came out into Lima and were protesting not only like the misogyny that they faced, but also the racism and, the severity of being both at the same time, of being ignored, but being over-sexualized and facing violence just because of your identity. So they actually, Nuevo Peru just lost an election, but there will be another election in 2021. This one is going to be for the presidency. So Kuczynski's vice president ended up succeeding his position, and that's Martin Vizcarra. And he is just, the same as him, another right-winger. They ended up, I think they suspended the Congress at some time because even the Congress is full of corruption. It's just, it's everywhere. So we'll see. There's better hope for these upcoming elections. And not to say that like we need to be reformist about it, but Peru, I think, is entering a new phase, and it was a hard one to come out of, right? Because you just spent like 20, 30 years in a civil war and being fed right after that anti-communism, and they're still being fed that.
I think that's the right position because I feel like I go harder on social democrats in the imperialist countries and the first world countries because of the class nature of social democracy here versus in Latin America. When you're talking about a country like Peru, where slave owners and the criollos and the descendants of the Spanish conquistadors are in power, even something as modest as raising the minimum wage or a worker's safety at the workplace, even that is considered like grounds for killing people because they're so-called communist, and the dangers people face out there are much higher than they do in the imperialist countries, and I think that supporting a democratic socialist movement like Nuevo Peru is, as a communist, I think is the right position, but also using that space to promote the ideas of socialism, of communism, to be like, this is the first step and we need to keep building on that. And I think that's the right approach because a lot of times people have this kind of fetishism of violence, and they only think of revolution in terms of like, you have to pick up the gun, like the posters of like people with guns and like that, which is like part of it, that there's a time and a place for that. And a lot of times people don't want to, focus on the important ground, building the base and building a movement. And I'm glad you mentioned that position because I think it's the correct one.
Yeah, there's always that time and the place that you gotta be aware of. Even the MRTA, and I believe Sendero Luminoso too, they had their legal wing and they had their armed wing. They were really separate. But then they also have their education, right? They educated their cadre in all of the aspects. I think they had 3 different branches. One that led the party's politics and the party line. One that was operating in legal ways, so voting, trying to do the reformist way of uplifting people's conditions, and then the armed wing that was ready to build an armed revolution. But you can't make the mistake that Sendero Luminoso made again, was just doing it too soon and too forceful instead of educating the people and getting them ready instead of forcing it. And that was their biggest downfall, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, for sure. Cool. Kayla, it's been a real pleasure. How can people follow you? Again, we've been speaking with Kayla Pop, who's a Peruvian-Haitian student and worker based in my hometown, New York. I'm out here in Cali right now, but I'm born and raised in New York. Kayla's out there right now holding it down. How can people follow you?
I'm Perucha Kayla on Instagram, but my Instagram's not fun. And you'll see Maritigue's quote on my Instagram bio. It's el marxismo-leninismo es el sendero luminoso del futuro. I want to get that tattooed.
It's a beautiful quote. It's an optimistic quote too. It's not pessimistic. It's optimistic in the sense that it fights for a better future, a better life for the poor Peruvian people who want safety, security, food to eat, land. And I think it's a very beautiful quote. Kayla, thanks again. My name is Ramiro. We're with Anticonquista. Anticonquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. We're not an NGO. We're not a white-led media organization. We're not a white-led political party. We are revolutionary communist Latin American and Caribbean people in the diaspora talking about our history, our people. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Kayla. Peace out. Hope you all have a great week.